Business as usual. The European Commission says that companies and workers won't go back to business as usual until a vaccine will be there. And in the meantime, however, every country in Europe is drawing plans to lifting the restrictions and go back somehow to mitigate the devastation of the situation, the devastating situation. And we all know that a gradual exit from lockdowns will inevitably lead to a spike of new cases, and this will threaten possibly the healthcare systems. And again, we will risk to go back in another situation, in another lockdown. So the role that companies will play in all this is really key. On one side, they will guarantee themselves the restart. On the other side, according to how they handle the situation with their workforce, they will contribute to instigate and or facilitate the responsible behavior. So employers understandly want to keep their business up and open and going, but it is also all of which is absolutely key for every country. However, achieving the goal is not of course a journey that the company would do on its own. It's not only a matter of protocols, it is a matter very much of relationship. Curiously, going through some statistics, I love statistics, not always they say the truth. However, I was wondering, the 83% of stakeholders say that they fear about, they are considering the impact that the company will go through because of the health emergency, but at the same time, just 10% of them really have a plan that is ready and in place. So now I came across during my research a poster that was added to a researcher from Joe Atkinson, is a younger researcher at London School of Economics, who said, who was investigating about the legal perspective and the legal consequences of taking attached to taking workers back at work. And without entering the legal aspect of all this, I would just point out that the last two sentences of this post, where the worker express doubts and perplexity about his employer, and finally conclude saying, my employer is carrying a risk assessment from the comfort of his own front room. So I think there is a very big element that we all need to consider, and is managing anxiety. So managing anxiety, why? I read the director of, I don't know, probably you know him, the director of the Center for Human Resources at the Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania, saying, trying to prevent employees from staying home with formal rules is unlikely to work. So the very best approach will be to asking employees and for their help, but to get a result from employees is very much about demonstrating that the employer is doing effectively his best to keep the space healthy, and to at work, and that the company cannot stay in business without his workforce. So employers that have a honest relationship are very likely, and that's exactly my experience when I was managing large groups in the previous reality, is very much about creating a honest relationship where employer and employees are peer. And in this this COVID emergency will probably help all of us to create a new, at least to explore a new relationship where the worker is collaborating to create this new normal. Bill Gates, back in 2015, was advising, was suggesting in a talk the risk that was coming up. He was talking about the risk for that if anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades. He was saying this will not be a nuclear war, it will be a pandemic. So it seems unfortunately that we are going through a, let's say, a new normal where pandemics are just usual, they are just normal. And the first question that we all ask ourselves in thinking of protocols and rules and systems that we need to put in place is when this pandemic will end. And apparently scientists, the answer of our scientists is that it will not end at all. This virus seems to be here to stay, and unless we are able to eradicate it, but we all know that eradicate a virus requires, requires to have in place a very effective vaccine, which is, let's say, at least 18 months away from today. So we definitely need to find another way to manage the situation today, and considering that all the risk and the implication that are attached, especially talking of people and managing workforce. Certainly at a certain point it will the virus will end up finding less people that can be attacked. So for example, Italy and Spain, they respectively have between 40 and 26 of the population, percent of the population already affected, so they will be likely be the first to develop a kind of herd immunity. But again, it is far, and between today and that time, we can only hope in antibody testing that will eventually say if an individual was had the virus, and eventually hopefully scientists will be able to define patterns and identify for how long these individuals are eventually immune. Certainly also when we will have this information, the question will be to know for how long they will be immune. What is sure in all these scenario, of course, is only one thing, that viruses are quite normal, or going to, there will be other virus, they will last for quite a while, and we definitely need to find a way to design a new norm with our workforce. So now I think it is important to see what companies are doing to manage the situation, and I think Tom is is the best person to give an overview about what are the implications with the HR perspective of the next step that all of us as responsible of our workforce will all actions that we will take put in place and how to manage from there. Thank you, Tom. I hand it to you.
Brilliant, thanks. So as we think about some of the words that Laura's just used, they've not, from an employee-employer relationship point, they're not really words that we're used to hearing or understanding or even needing to be part of our vocabulary. We heard things like immunity, virus, pandemic, resurgence, second waves. Just before we started this webinar, I happened to be listening to the news, and in the UK, unfortunately, our daily death total has gone up again after a couple of days decline. These are all things that we are all now starting to hear globally on a, let's call it minute by minute basis. But from an organizational perspective, if we think, what is an organization? Well, an organization is a collection of people. It doesn't matter if it's 2 people in a 2-man business or 2-woman business or 130,000 people in a global multinational. You've still got people. And at the center of our nervous system, I'm sure if anybody who's on the webinar has looked at anything to do with psychology will remember that we have something right in the middle of our cortex is called the amygdala, which is the green part that's on that little picture. And that's basically the part of our primeval brain that is responsible for our fight and flight response system, which is the sympathetic nervous system. It's also responsible for the parasitic nervous system, which is our freeze response. So what this does from a primal level, it's buried that deep and has been with us since we were cavemen and women. It is the overarching part of our body and our function that will decide how we are going to respond to things that come towards us, whether that be back in the days when we're fighting for our food, all the way through to now, a pandemic coming towards us and we're being bombarded with information that we may not understand that is scary. So when we are frightened by something, our amygdala will kick in and it will start to kick off how we're actually going to respond. Now, if you've got an organization of 130,000 people and you're a global company, all of these people hearing slightly different things at slightly different times, you need to be aware of how that's actually going to start impacting with all of these fight, flight, freeze responses going off. How are leaders responding all the way through to how are your employees responding? So we can move forward on the slides, please, Laura. What is currently really being challenged goes all the way back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which again, if anybody's done anything around organizational development, will know this paradigm and will know this pyramid inside out. Maslow, who was a psychologist, basically states that for us to become what we want to be within ourselves, we have to have some fundamental blocks in place first of all. It starts with psychological needs around air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, and reproduction. And then once you know that is stable, you can then start thinking about safety needs. So personal security, employment, resources, health, and property. And these 2 core basic fundamentals of our being are now being challenged on a day-to-day basis. Some of us within our psychological needs or physiological needs, some people don't have shelter, or some people do have shelter, but not necessarily with the people they would expect to have shelter with. Safety needs, this is kind of the biggest area at the moment. We are concerned for our physical safety, but not only that, we are also worried about our employment safety. How many companies are actually going to survive what we are going through at the moment and come out the other end? It starts to attack us at a very deep, primal level. And that's really some of the things that the organization actually needs to focus on. Now, organizations will be very, very used to things like looking at change from a perspective of organizational development and human psychology. Big organizations in particular spend a lot of time understanding things like the fight, flight, freeze reaction and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to make sure they can actually put things in place that enable employees to thrive. But usually change is pretty much driven by an organization. Yes, there will be outside influences driving the change sometimes, but the vast majority of change will be driven by the organization. And that is therefore who is driving the rhetoric, the noise that we all hear, for us to hang on to and to start believing in the messages that we're hearing. But if we could move on the slide, please, Laura. With this pandemic, the noise is coming from everywhere. It is not just coming from our employers. This isn't just an organizational change reacting to an economic security or an economic issue that we are cutting some jobs to save some money to satisfy our shareholders. This goes back to our prime states. And we start listening to the people who we believe and who we trust in. So do we trust in our employers or the press or other forms of media? Social media, I think, is one of the biggest and quickest forms of media out there, but we're never quite sure necessarily what the truth with social media actually is. Is it verifiable? That it's actually credible information that's coming through. If it's not, but you're still hanging on to that information, or your employees are hanging on to information believing it is true because it came from, I don't know, BuzzFeed or wherever, or somewhere even less reputable, that starts to give the employer quite a lot of issues to deal with. People are influenced by all of those around us and those who they actually look up to. Some people are going to be influenced by celebrities or influencers. Some people will only take a view from the medical professionals. So trying to bring all of this together as an employer and still trying to keep a business going, or some businesses we have seen around the world, actually they have stopped their business for now and they are relying on government support to help their business survive and pay their employees. But organizations need to start thinking about how we are going to get the workforce back at some point in some way, shape or form. Now, from my perspective, that's not around kind of the pursuit of profit against everything else. It is the pursuit of actually getting people back out to work because that's the right thing to do when it is safe to do so. Even once things are deemed as safe, organizations are still going to have an issue because noise will still be around. You could have the medical professional saying it is now safe, restrictions can be lifted. I think in all countries, particularly across Europe, as I've been focusing on, individuals are wanting to start to remove lockdowns, not just necessarily because they want to go back to work, but because they don't want to be chained within their homes anymore. It is time to actually start thinking from a business perspective, how we can actually make our employees safe, how they can work safely, how they can work securely. So if we could move the slide on, please, Laura. We need to think about, where do employees feel safe right now? Do they feel safe at home? You would hope so, because that's where people have got the biggest control. I'm not going to go down the route of what may or may not happen in the home for people to feel safe or less safe, things like domestic violence. That's an issue in its own right. But on the main, people would in general be feeling safe at home because they control the environment that they are in. They can control who comes in and who comes out and what happens within the home environment. Are people going to start feeling safe commuting? Well, they might feel safe if they're commuting in their private cars, driving to and from work, but would they feel as safe commuting if the train services come back up and running and they start to get as busy as they were in the past? And eventually, the workplace. Is the workplace safe? So we've heard lots of governments around the world talk about social distancing. I have to admit, I hate that phrase because I don't agree that that's what we're doing. I think we are physically distancing. Particularly in the UK, we hear a lot around having kind of 2 meters space between ourselves and kind of anybody else. That's physical distancing. So is the workplace that you are running, that you are in, is it actually set up and designed for a new way of working to have much greater space? If you're in a big city centre, probably not, because you pay per square foot, so you're buying the smallest amount of square feet that you can to get the most amount of people in. If you're in a big high-rise building, well, on a normal day, personally, I've spent some time working in, you know, one of these big 32-story tower blocks, and on a normal day it could take you 15 minutes to get from the ground floor up to your desk, because just the volume of people trying to get through. If you then add social distancing to that, you might not make it to your desk before the day is done. And that's just in an office environment. How about things like factories? How can factories actually operate, including social distancing? So there are some big questions that organizations need to ask themselves to start working out, how can we make things safe for our employees? But also, once we have made it safe for our employees, how are we going to start the conversation to hope to enable them to trust what we're doing is the right thing? So let's very quickly look at some examples of what some organizations are doing. So if we could move forward, please, Laura. Organizations are looking at things in a couple of dimensions. One is, as I say, around physical distancing, and the other aspect is around health and what people are actually doing to help promote a physically healthy and physical and mental healthy workforce. So on the physical distancing, we've got organizations doing things like staggering shift patterns. We've got the UK government suggesting that it might be appropriate for businesses to look at staggered start and end times as well, because that would then also help public transport systems. In their big buildings where they have originally got things like canteens or on-site restaurants, they are being closed. Basically, what they're trying to do is prevent the congregation of individuals. So they're making it a little bit more difficult to congregate. So canteens, you would be congregating. And also there are things like visual clues. So when we are in our workplaces, we become blind in general to what's around us because we know these places so well. We don't necessarily know what might be 2 meters away from one desk to another, as an example. So for example, I've heard on the grapevine that Cushman and Wakefield are using visual clues. So they're doing things like putting coloured carpet tiles around the desk to indicate what is a safe distance to stay away. Then on the other side, around health. So big organizations will be able to invest a lot more money into doing things to promote a healthy workplace. So for example, our organization is going to go down the route of contracting, where governments might not be doing it. Are the organization actually going to pick that up and do it for their employees? Are they going to start organising for testing to be complete once testing is available, both preventative and antibody testing? Some organisations, as we've seen around the world, are introducing infrared body scanning temperature checks at the door. So the ability of the organisation to actually take somebody's body temperature on the way in. That starts giving rise to quite complex issues around health data and the organization's ability to hold and retain and rely on that information. I'm not going to go into kind of the liability side of it because that could be a whole other talk in itself, but organizations need to be aware that depending on what they're doing, they may end up having a level of culpability. Also, we can also see that organizations are introducing PPE into factories, PPE into customer-facing type work as well, particularly in supermarkets. And these ideas are really to promote not only your own health as an individual, but also the health of your customers and your stakeholders. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Laura. What is all this in aid of, though? This is all about building trust with your employees, that you as an organisation are doing the right thing. So organisations need to think about how they can start either to rebuild trust or capitalise on the trust that they already had in the bank, for want of a better phrase. Are you going to be the biggest voice in that crowd that we saw of all of those different influences? Are you, as the organisation, are you going to be the loudest voice that enables your employees to trust the actions that you're taking are for their protection and to help promote the workplace moving forward? Now, we can't really do anything around trust without good levels of communication. So if we could move on to the final slide, of mine, please, Laura. Communication is absolutely key. We all know this. I think we all like to forget how important it is. I think we are all learning yet again the vast level of importance, particularly from our governments at the moment. Without communication, the individual will start to assume, and I've seen this on a day-to-day level, helping organisations move through smaller type organisational changes rather than big changes that are coming through here. So we have to look at things like who should be the primary communicator about COVID-19 within the organisation. Research that's been underdone is there's actually quite a split. Okay, half of the people saying the CEO, but then you've got others, the chief operating officers, the CHROs. My personal view, it should be a combined and one voice. Again, as you look into an organisation, as you as the individual, you have to think, who do I trust? Most people in a company tend to trust their immediate line manager. The trust levels might not go that much further as you go hierarchically up the organisation. And I know I'm tarring everybody with the same brush. There are some organisations out there who do a fantastic job in building trust through communication, and CEOs have a very high trust rating. But that's not true of all companies. If we boil it down to who do I trust, it is the person who I see on a day-to-day basis, the person who effectively is responsible for hiring and firing me. So how are organisations actually helping their leaders build the messaging and in terms of what their response is doing to help promote a healthy workspace for employees to come back into? So at that point, I'll bring Laura back in. Thank you, Laura.
Well, attention, and I think it requires some more detailed explanation about what is it in reality. And said that, I mean, processes are good, but frankly, they are not enough to keep spaces and workplaces COVID-free. There is, and I absolutely agree, the big point is building a trust around whatever we are going to do. There is something else that we have to consider, and this is the two main items, the two main tools that we are at the moment talking about. On one side, the extremely attentional and advertised contact tracing apps, and on the other side, the immunity passports, two elements that seem to look at the same thing, but frankly are absolutely different. So on one side, we have a tool that seems also sponsored and developed apart from Google, etc., and the protocol that Google and Apple are building. There are also private companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers who are developing their own contact tracing app to enable individuals within a corporate to, let's say, to communicate or to make it evident to their line manager that they were affected, found positive to COVID, and eventually the line manager can, from this, verify which were the contacts that the individual came in touch with in the previous 15 days, and eventually inform them so that they can eventually self-isolate, test, etc., etc. So this is one thing that moves from let's say, a self-declaration where the individual says, I am ill, I am positive. And the second one is, on the contrary, the immunity passport, a tool that at the moment is still a dream, let's say, in the sense that immunity tests are not yet available. But when a test will be available, then there will be the need to make something and to make it evident and verifiable, the certificate that says whether or not the individual was positive, and whether or not the individual was has developed some kind of of immunity, of antibodies. Of course, we know that antibodies may not last forever, because this is the discussion, but that's not really the problem, in the sense that we expect that some kind of pattern will be identified, saying that immunity lasts for X number of days, weeks, months, or whatever. Our point, the point that I make, is how do we use immunity passports or eventually contact tracing systems within a corporate context?